Hi Reddit, this is an all-your-base quick tip on drum bus EQ and saturation. We've got a BHK break here. It's break number 18 from the Industrial Strength Records BHK Special Edition Volume 1. It's a pretty nice sounding break already, but we're going to try to process it a little bit to bring out some of the tones that we like and then give it some compression, or rather some saturation to both improve our headroom and also to give it a bit more warmth and a bit more harmonic saturation and some of those nice overtones. So let's start out by listening to this break. As you can see, it sounds pretty nice already. We don't need to do a lot to it. And by the time things get to your drum bus, if you're building your own breaks or if you're processing one hits or whatever you're doing, hopefully you won't have to do a lot. And that's sort of the garbage in, garbage out philosophy. You want things coming into that drum bus to already sound pretty nice. You can't do a lot of repair work on your drum bus or on your master when you're trying to mix things down. You want to do it on the source signals as much as possible. So let's assume you've got a nice, well put together break, or you're using a nice loop like this one that I'm using. And you want to just do that last little bit of polish to bring out really those nice characteristics. So let's start with an EQ8. And we're going to try to identify some changes we'd like to make just to the tone and to the overall sound of this break. And a lot of people will tell you when you're EQing that one of the best ways to do it is to take one of these nodes here and create a nice tight bandwidth peak and then sweep that up and down the frequency spectrum. And I think that's terrible advice, and I'd like to tell you why. The main reason is that our brains are just really bad at processing continuous signals. So if you sweep this up, and you've got it at 534 hertz, and now you move it up to 650 hertz, can your brain really tell the difference? Probably not. So over that entire sweep, those sounds just get sort of confused together, just blended together in your brain. It's really hard for it to tell the difference both between an A and a B, between two different frequencies, and between a peak and the original sound. It's just not a very efficient way to zero in on EQ changes you like to make. The other problem is that you're not training your brain. You're not training your ear to recognize frequencies, to recognize the effects of certain EQ changes to the underlying sound. What I prefer to do instead is to listen to the sound and then get a really good picture in my brain of how I want it to sound after I make some EQ changes. So let's listen to this sound again. And in my brain, it sounds a bit more shiny, shimmery, so there's some of that higher range coming through a bit more, and a bit less muddy, so there's a bit less of that low mid from the kick and some of the underlying break layers coming through. And when I think shine and shimmer, my ear tells me that's around 10K. And you'll notice that these nodes are already in spots on the frequency spectrum that are commonly EQ'd frequencies. Now, if you're using an older EQ, if you're using a lot of analog EQs, they were not parametric EQs. They gave you a fixed frequency, and then you could decide how much to boost or cut it by, and if you were lucky, you could change the Q between wide and narrow. So sometimes working within those constraints can actually be a very nice way to limit yourself and to really learn within those constraints what's possible. So let's take this 10K range here. Let's give that a boost by about 2.5 to 3K. One of the things that I'd like to really stress is when you're doing drum bus or mix bus or any sort of bus processing, that you want to really use subtle processing. You don't need a 6K boost here. You need maybe 2 to 3K. And in this 5K range here, I'm actually going to try to find something that's more 300 to 400, so I'm just going to go ahead and type in 350 here. Because that 5 to 800 hertz range is where some of the wood from the snare is going to be, and we don't really want to get rid of that. So let's take this 350 and let's drop it down by a 2 dB cut, and let's compare AB with it off and then on. Okay, that's a little bit of mud that's gone there. Maybe this could be a little bit less. Maybe this is 1.5K. Oops, negative 1.5K, excuse me. But I like what's happening up here, although it maybe could use a bit less bandwidth, a bit smaller Q. So let's A/B that again. You'll notice that I'm not making those changes while I'm listening to the sound. I really want to have a picture in my brain that I'm A/Bing with, rather than gradually making changes to the EQ as I go along. All right, that sounds really nice. Some of the snare, the actual rattle of the snare is coming through. Some the hits of the hi-hats are a bit more noticeable, and that mud from the kick is reduced a little bit, but not so much that you get a hollow sound where you're really notching out that lower mid-range. So now that we've got our EQ under control, let's move on to loudness. Let's move on to trying to flatten out some of the peaks while maintaining the transient, the punch of the transient. So that when we mix this in with other sounds, we get more headroom, so it's a bit easier to mix overall. A lot of you probably immediately would reach for a limiter to accomplish this, but what I'd like to demonstrate for you is that a limiter doesn't actually do what you'd expect it to do. In terms of, it does reduce the peaks, but it does so by cutting a hole in the sound immediately following the peaks. So let's go ahead and look at this graphic here. You can see that there's a maximum headroom limit of 0 dB, and when a limiter encounters that peak, it's going to notch out the sound to make up for that. And this hole here is what's getting rid of all of your punch. So let's listen to this drum loop with a limiter on it so that you can hear how much of that punch is removed by the limiter. Now, immediately it's not going to sound as good because it's not as loud. And one of the tricks that our brain plays on us is that things that are louder sound better. So what we really want to do is we want to make up that gain reduction here so that they have a similar apparent volume, apparent loudness, and then we'll A/B against the same apparent loudness with and without the limiter. And that's a good idea whenever you're making changes to your tracks, whenever you're trying to process them somehow. Make sure that when you do an A/B comparison, that you're comparing them with the A and B at the same apparent loudness. So let's listen to that again. So same apparent loudness, but with the limiter on, you can hear, I think, that it sounds pretty muffled. So let's throw away the limiter. That's not what we want. And let's switch to a saturator. Now what a saturator is going to do is it will cut off this peak. It's going to clip this peak, but it will maintain the body of the sound and that clipping effect with a nice analog saturation or a simulated analog saturation will actually add some pleasing harmonic overtones to the sound. So it'll actually get beefier and sort of meatier at the same time. So let's use this saturator and let's try to compare an A/B at the same apparent loudness. Let me actually start with it off, sorry. So not as bad as the limiter, but we're not really getting much gain reduction here. Let's move this off to the soft sine saturation type. As these go up from top to bottom, they generally get more aggressive in their saturation. Let's turn on soft clip, which will prevent some of the hard clipping artifacts from showing up. And while you won't really hear those, they will add some upper partial noise to your sound because they sort of square off more aggressively the waves. And that ends up being harsh and sort of fatiguing on the ear. So we want to turn soft clipping on, and then we're going to switch to soft sine, see how that sounds. First with it off and then on. So immediately it sounds a lot meatier, a lot more punchy, but it's also louder. So let's again correct that apparent loudness so we're really A/Bing against something that's comparable. Okay, so that's similar in apparent loudness, but you can, I think, agree with me that we didn't lose as much of the punch of the drums as we did with the limiter. And if we look at the meter here, we'll see that we go from peaks of up to +1 dB to peaks of almost -4 dB. So that's an almost 5 dB increase in headroom with the same apparent loudness. And that's something you want to keep in mind in general with your mixing, is that one of your goals is to increase apparent loudness while at the same time increasing headroom. So you want it to sound loud without peaking very high. So limiting is a traditional tool for that. Saturation can also be very useful, especially for a sound like drum and bass. It really is all about the analog saturation sound. So in addition to giving you that headroom, you're also giving it more of a drum and bass sound by giving it that nice beefy analog saturation. So let's listen to this track before and after EQ and saturation. You can see the difference we've made just by a couple small, relatively simple changes. So I think you can agree with me that the B sounds punchier, has a bit more shimmer and sheen and snap to it, and it's a bit meatier with the saturation. And also you can see that we've gained about 5 dB of headroom while making the sound actually sound louder and fatter. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you have any questions, please ask them in the Reddit post that I'll be making for this, and I will do my best to answer all of those. Have a good day. I'll talk to you next time.